Chapter 1.7.2 ConfigMaps. A config map is an API object that stores non-confidential data in key-value pairs, which pods can consume as environment variables, command line arguments, or configuration files in a volume. This allows for separation of environment-specific configurations from container images, making applications more portable. However, ConfigMap does not offer secrecy or encryption, so confidential data should be stored in a secret instead. Additional third-party tools can also be used to ensure data privacy. It is important to be cautious when deciding between ConfigMap and secret for data storage. Motivation. A config map is used to store configuration data separate from application code, allowing for flexibility in different environments. For example, using a config map, you can set the environment variable database host to localhost for development on your computer and to a Kubernetes service in the cloud. This allows for seamless debugging of code locally and in the cloud. However, ConfigMap has a limit of 1 MB and is not ideal for storing large amounts of data. In such cases, consider using a volume, separate database, or file service. ConfigMap object. A config map in Kubernetes is an API object used to store configuration data for other objects. It has data and binary data fields for key-value pairs, with data for UTF-8 strings and binary data for base64 encoded binary data. The name of a config map must be a valid DNS subdomain name with keys containing alphanumeric characters, or COM. Keys in data must not overlap with keys in binary data. As of v1.19, an immutable field can be added to create an immutable config map. Config maps and pods. A config map in Kubernetes can be used to configure containers within a pod. The pod and config map must be in the same namespace. There are 4 ways to use a config map to configure a container: by specifying command and args, environment variables, adding a file in a read-only volume, or writing code to read the config map using the Kubernetes API. The first 3 methods allow the kubelet to use the data from the config map when launching containers for a pod, while the 4th method requires writing code to read the config map. Accessing the Kubernetes API directly enables applications to subscribe to updates when the config map changes and react accordingly. This technique also allows access to config maps in different namespaces. In an example using a config map called Game Demo, different keys can be used to create multiple files within a pod by defining a volume and mounting it inside a container. Omitting the items array results in each key in the config map becoming a separate file within the pod. Using config maps. Config maps are resources in Kubernetes that can hold key-value pairs or configuration settings and can be used by various parts of the system. One common way to use config maps is to configure settings for containers running in a pod within the same namespace. Config maps can be mounted as data volumes in pods, allowing for easy access to configuration data. To mount a config map in a volume in a pod, you need to create or use an existing config map and modify the pod definition to add a volume and volume mounts to each container that needs the config map. When a config map mounted in a volume is updated, the projected keys are automatically updated as well. Config maps can also be consumed as environment variables in a pod. This can be done by adding environment variables for each config map key that you want to use in the env value from.configmapKeyRef field in the pod specification. The image or command line of the program running in the pod can then be modified to look for values in the specified environment variables. When using config maps as environment variables, you have the flexibility to select individual keys from the config map data to use in the pod. The range of characters allowed for environment variable names in pods is restricted, so it's important to ensure that keys meet the rules to be accessible to your container. Overall, config maps provide a convenient way to store configuration data and share it with different parts of the system in Kubernetes. Whether mounted as data volumes or consumed as environment variables, config maps offer flexibility and ease of use for managing configurations in pods. Immutable config maps. Kubernetes v1.21 introduces a new feature called Immutable Secrets and Config Maps, which allows users to set individual config maps and secrets as immutable. This feature is especially useful for clusters with a large number of config map to pod mounts, as it helps prevent accidental updates that could lead to application outages and improves cluster performance by reducing load on Kube API server. Once a config map is marked as immutable, the data cannot be reverted or mutated, and the only option is to delete and recreate the config map. It is recommended to also recreate existing pods that maintain a mount point to the deleted config map.